November 12th, 1944, Brooklyn, New York. A table groans under the weight of food. Pasta, meatballs, bread, cheese, wine. It's Brooklyn, 1944. An Italian prisoner of war sits frozen, his hands trembling as a shipyard worker pounds the table and curses the President of the United States. Giuseppe Russo waits for the knock on the door that will end them all. This is the story of how one Sunday dinner shattered everything a soldier believed about freedom, prosperity, and the war he was fighting. Giuseppe Russo's palms left wet marks on his wool trousers. The apartment smelled like his grandmother's kitchen in Palermo, garlic, tomato, basil, but everything else was wrong. Too loud, too much, too dangerous. Mr. DeMarco's fist hit the table again. That bastard in Washington takes 30%. 30! I break my back 10 hours a day, and Roosevelt's got his hand in my pocket. Giuseppe's throat closed. In Sicily, his neighbor Paolo had called Il Duce incompetent at a cafe. Quietly. Once. The Ovra came that night. Paolo's wife found his body 3 weeks later in a ditch outside Messina. Mrs. DeMarco emerged from the kitchen carrying another platter. More meatballs. Eat, Giuseppe. You're too skinny. Skinny. Giuseppe almost laughed. He'd gained 14 pounds in 3 months at the POW camp. 14 pounds, while his sister Maria's last letter described eating dandelion greens and chicory root, while his mother traded her wedding band for a kilo of flour on the black market. The mayor's an idiot, too, Mr. DeMarco continued, refilling Giuseppe's wine glass. Raises my property tax. Then the subway still smells like piss. What am I paying for? The teenage son, Vincent, reached across the table for more bread. Pop, you say that every week. Because it's true every week. Giuseppe counted the meatballs on the serving plate. 23. 23 meatballs for one meal for one family on an ordinary Sunday. His entire village hadn't seen that much meat since 1940. The daughter, Angela, 16, with her hair in pin curls, turned to Giuseppe. What's it like in Italy? Is it really as beautiful as the pictures? Beautiful. Giuseppe thought of the British bombs that cratered the Piazza Pretoria, the German trucks that stripped the countryside of everything edible, the American shells that turned the monastery at Monte Cassino into dust. It was, he said. Mr. DeMarco leaned back, wine glass in hand. My grandfather came from Napoli, 1889. Had nothing. Died with a house in Queens and money in the bank. That's America. Giuseppe had heard these stories at the camp. The guards told them, see what you were fighting against. See what your Duce kept from you. He'd dismissed it as propaganda. Lies designed to break their morale. But the food wasn't propaganda. The apartment, cramped, yes, with peeling wallpaper and a radiator that clanked, wasn't propaganda. Mr. DeMarco worked at the Navy Yard, a laborer. Not a soldier, not an officer, not a member of the fascist party. Just a man who welded ship hulls for $8 a day. $8 a day. Giuseppe earned 320 lire per month in the Italian army. Converted, that was about $3 for an entire month. Before the war, before the inflation, before the rationing. You okay, kid? Mr. DeMarco squinted at him. You look like you've seen a ghost. Giuseppe realized his hands were shaking. In Italy, he said slowly, if you said what you just said about Mussolini, about the Duce, the table went quiet. What would happen? Vincent asked. Giuseppe met the boy's eyes. Your family would disappear. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, and nobody would ask questions. Mrs. DeMarco crossed herself. Mr. DeMarco set down his glass, his expression shifting from jovial to something harder, older. Is that what you were fighting for? The question sat in the air like smoke. Giuseppe had no answer, or rather, he had the answer he'd repeated for 5 years. Glory. Empire. The resurrection of Rome. Italy's rightful place among nations. Empty words. He heard them now for what they were. I thought I was, Giuseppe said. I don't know anymore. Mr. DeMarco nodded slowly. That's called thinking. It's allowed here. Hell, it's required. Now eat before the food gets cold. 6 months earlier, June 1944, somewhere in the Atlantic. The Liberty ship's hold stank of vomit, diesel fuel, and 400 unwashed men. Giuseppe had surrendered to the Americans in Tunisia in May 1943, spent a year in a camp in North Africa, and now found himself crossing the ocean to an enemy nation, prisoner of war. The words felt abstract. He wasn't chained. The American guards were bored teenagers who played cards and shared cigarettes. One of them, a boy from Ohio with terrible Italian pronunciation, tried to teach Giuseppe baseball. Like cricket, he explained, but better. Giuseppe had never seen cricket either. The ship docked in Newport News, Virginia. Giuseppe's first sight of America was a harbor filled with more ships than he'd known existed. Destroyers, cargo vessels, tankers, all painted in dazzle camouflage, all moving with the precision of a factory floor. In the distance, cranes lifted cargo containers the size of houses. His friend Carlo, captured at the same time, stood beside him at the rail. "Madonna," Carlo breathed. "How many ships does America have?" "All of them, apparently," Giuseppe said. They'd been told America was drowning in debt, collapsing under the weight of its decadent capitalism, that Roosevelt's New Deal had bankrupted the nation, that the Americans were soft, undisciplined, incapable of sustaining a real war effort. The harbor suggested otherwise. The camp in upstate New York was nothing like Giuseppe expected. Barracks, yes, but clean ones with real beds. 3 meals per day, sometimes bland, often strange, but always sufficient. Work details in nearby farms, where prisoners earned 80 cents per day in canteen scrip. 80 cents. For a day's labor, Giuseppe could buy cigarettes, soap, chocolate, even beer at the camp store. The farmer, a man named Henderson with a face like leather, treated the Italian POWs like hired hands rather than enemies. He showed them how to harvest corn, criticized their technique, paid them fairly. When one prisoner, Marco, cut his hand on a thresher blade, Henderson drove him to the hospital himself. "You fix him up right," Henderson told the doctor. "He's a good worker." Giuseppe watched this interaction with the feeling of a man whose map had just revealed itself to be upside down. In the Italian army, a wounded private would wait hours for medical attention if an officer had a headache. Here, a prisoner, an enemy, received immediate care. "They treat their enemies better than our own side treated us," Carlos said that night in the barracks. It wasn't quite true. The guards maintained distance. Rules existed. Barbed wire still surrounded the compound. But the casual violence Giuseppe had witnessed in the Italian military was absent. The contempt officers showed enlisted mien. The routine theft of rations by supply sergeants. The expectation that soldiers were expendable machinery. If this was how America treated its prisoners, Giuseppe thought, how did it treat its citizens? August 1944. The farm in New York. The corn stood taller than Giuseppe's head, rustling in the August heat. He worked alongside Carlo and 3 other POWs, moving down the rows with practiced efficiency. Henderson had taught them well. A truck pulled up to the field's edge. Henderson's daughter Claire, 17, with her father's direct gaze, hopped out. She wore dungarees and her hair tied back, looking nothing like the carefully groomed Italian women Giuseppe had known. "Pop says take 15 minutes, she called. "There's lemonade in the cooler." The prisoners gathered in the shade of the truck. Claire poured drinks into tin cups, chatting easily about the weather, the corn yield. Her brother, who was somewhere in France with the 82nd Airborne. "You worried about him?" Carlo asked. Claire's expression tightened briefly. "Every day. But that's what happens when your country's at war. Everyone contributes." Giuseppe drank his lemonade. It was cold, tart, perfect. In Sicily, his family hadn't seen sugar rations in 2 years. Here, a teenage girl served iced drinks to enemy prisoners in the middle of a workday. In Italy, Giuseppe said carefully, "Women don't typically work farms." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Who does the work when the men are at war?" "Other men. Old men, boys." "Sounds inefficient." She smiled. "Here, if you can work, you work. Gender doesn't matter when there's corn to harvest." Later, Giuseppe asked Henderson about it. The farmer shrugged. "Claire's strong, smart, and willing. Why would I turn down help? But she's your daughter. Which means I want her capable of anything. World doesn't stop for tradition." Giuseppe had spent his whole life in a society of rigid hierarchies. Men above women, officers above soldiers, party members above citizens, the rich above the poor. Everyone knew their place, and questioning it was dangerous. Here, a teenage girl drove trucks, made decisions, spoke her mind. And nobody found it strange. And if that impacted your understanding of the story, I like shows that more stories like this matter. Let's continue. October 1944. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Giuseppe's mother had found a way to send it through the Red Cross. He read it 3 times, each reading making his chest tighter. "Dearest Giuseppe, we thank God you are alive and safe. The Allies came through our village last month. The fighting was terrible. 3 houses burned. Old Mrs. Catalano died in her cellar, but now it is quiet. The British soldiers gave us tins of food. Real meat, Giuseppe," Maria cried when she tasted it. "We had forgotten what meat was like. The priest says America will help rebuild. He says the fascists lied to us about everything. Your father doesn't speak about politics anymore. He seems very tired, very old. Stay safe, my son. Perhaps in America you will find something worth bringing home." Giuseppe folded the letter carefully. Carlo watched from his bunk. "Bad news. My village survived, but only barely. The question," Carlo said, "is what we're going back to, if there's anything to go back to." Giuseppe had been thinking about this for weeks. Italy was in chaos. The government had split. The Allies occupied the south, while Germans held the north. His Sicily was technically liberated, but from what he read in the carefully censored newspapers, liberation meant hunger, rubble, and Allied military governance. "Do you think?" Giuseppe asked slowly. "We were on the wrong side?" Carlo was quiet for a long time. "I think there were no right sides, only survivors." But Giuseppe wasn't sure anymore. He'd seen how America worked, the casual abundance, the freedom of speech, the dignity afforded even to prisoners. Not perfection. The Negro soldiers ate separately, lived separately, were treated as lesser. The hypocrisy was obvious, but even with its flaws, this system functioned better than anything Giuseppe had known. The Italian fascist promise had been strength, order, imperial glory. Instead, it delivered poverty, defeat, and dead neighbors in ditches for speaking unwelcome truths. November 1944. The invitation. Henderson approached Giuseppe one Saturday morning. "My cousin's family in Brooklyn wants to host some POWs for Sunday dinner. Sort of a church program thing. You interested?" Giuseppe hesitated. "Is that allowed?" "Apparently. The camp commander approved it. Thinks it's good for morale or whatever. You'd leave Sunday morning, back by 8 evening. Why would Americans want enemy soldiers in their homes?" Henderson scratched his jaw. "Probably because they're Italian-American and figure you're not really the enemy, just some poor bastard who got drafted into someone else's war. That about right." Giuseppe couldn't argue with that assessment, which brought him to Brooklyn, to the DeMarco apartment, to the table groaning with food and the dangerous freedom of speech. November 12, 1944. After dinner, the men retired to the small living room while the women cleared the table. Giuseppe tried to help, but Mrs. DeMarco shooed him away. "You're a guest." In Italy, the separation would be absolute. Men to one room, women to another, invisible walls of propriety. Here, Angela kept wandering in to join the conversation, and nobody told her to leave. Mr. DeMarco lit a cigarette and offered one to Giuseppe. "So what did you do before the war?" "I was studying engineering." "In Palermo?" "Yeah." "What kind?" "Civil. Bridges, roads. I wanted to build things." Mr. DeMarco nodded. "Useful skill. You'll need it after all this is over. From what I hear, Europe's pretty beat up." Vincent, the son, leaned forward. "What's it like, fighting in the war?" "Vincent," Mr. DeMarco warned. "It's okay," Giuseppe said. He thought about how to answer honestly. "Mostly it's boring. You wait, you march, you dig trenches, you wait more. Then suddenly it's chaos and terror, and people you talked to that morning are dead. And then it's boring again." "You kill anyone?" Vincent asked. "Vincent." Giuseppe met the boy's eyes. "Yes. I don't know how many. You don't usually see them. You shoot at movement, at sounds, at orders. Afterward, you don't look closely." The room was quiet. Angela had stopped in the doorway, her expression serious. "I'm not proud of it," Giuseppe continued. "I'm not ashamed either. It was war. We all did things we'll carry forever." Mr. DeMarco exhaled smoke. "My brother was in the last war, France. He came back different, wouldn't talk about it, drank himself to death by 1925. He paused. "I'm glad Vincent's too young for this one. I hope it's over before he's old enough." "It will be," Giuseppe said with certainty. He'd seen the American supply lines, the endless resources, the industrial capacity. Germany and Japan can't win. It's just mathematics now. How long until the math becomes obvious? "Sounds like you've switched sides," Vincent said, not accusingly, just observing. Giuseppe considered this. I don't think I have a side anymore. I just want it to end so I can go home and build bridges instead of destroying them." Mrs. DeMarco appeared with coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute Giuseppe's family drank. "You talk about building. That's good. Enough destroying. The world needs builders now." They talked until evening about Palermo's architecture, about Brooklyn's neighborhoods, about engineering and baseball and the differences between Italian and American food. Normal conversation, the kind Giuseppe hadn't experienced in years. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. DeMarco packed a box, bread, cheese, some cookies she'd baked. "For the camp. Share with your friends." "You don't have to." "I know. Take it anyway." Mr. DeMarco walked Giuseppe to the door. The loud, profane man from dinner seemed quieter now, more thoughtful. "You're a good kid, Giuseppe. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong government. But a good kid." He extended his hand. Giuseppe shook it. "When this is over," Mr. DeMarco said, "you come back to Brooklyn. Come back as a free man, not a prisoner. See what America's really like. Maybe you'll want to stay, maybe not, but you should see it." On the truck ride back to camp, Giuseppe was silent. Carlo, who'd gone to a different family, chattered about the meal, the strange American customs, the kindness of strangers. Giuseppe barely heard him. He was thinking about Mr. DeMarco's casual treason, cursing the president in his own home, and how nobody came to arrest him. About Claire Henderson driving trucks and making decisions. About the simple abundance of a working-class Sunday dinner. About the profound, disturbing possibility that everything he'd been taught about the world was backwards. December 1944. The decision. The war news was unmistakably one-directional now. The Allies had liberated Paris. Soviet forces pushed toward Germany from the east. Italy's fate was already decided. Occupied, divided, irrelevant to the war's conclusion. Giuseppe lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. Carlo was writing a letter to his parents in Calabria. Another prisoner, Antonio, played cards with some of the guards. "What are you going to do after?" Giuseppe asked Carlo. "After what?" "After the war, when they send us home." Carlo set down his pen. "Go back to my village. Help rebuild. Find a wife if any women will have me. Plant olives. The usual life." "What if there's nothing to go back to?" "There's always something. Dirt, at least. Calabrian dirt grows olives. That's all I need." Giuseppe envied Carlo's certainty, but Giuseppe had seen too much now. He'd seen how the other half, the winning half, lived. Not just wealth, though that was stark, but the casual freedoms, the assumption that tomorrow would come, the ability to complain about taxes without fearing midnight arrests. "I think I might stay," Giuseppe said. Carlo looked up sharply. "In America? Maybe, if they'll let me. After the war, I mean. Come back legally, like Mr. DeMarco's grandfather. And leave Italy forever?" "Italy left us first," Giuseppe said quietly. "Il Duce's Italy, the Italy that sent us to die for glory that never existed. I don't owe that Italy anything." "Your family, I'll send money, American dollars. That'll help them more than my presence in a starving village." Carlo shook his head slowly. "You've changed, Giuseppe. We've all changed. That's what happens in wars. You just notice mine because I'm talking about it." But Carlo was right. Giuseppe had changed. The man who boarded the Liberty ship 6 months ago believed in hierarchy, order, national destiny. That man was gone, dissolved by Sunday dinners and lemonade in August fields and the simple observation that the enemy treated him better than his own commanders ever had. January 1945. Henderson brought newspapers to the farm occasionally. Giuseppe read them hungrily, his English improving daily. The stories painted a picture of America at war, women working in factories, citizens buying war bonds, communities organizing scrap drives, but also labor strikes, political arguments, criticism of military strategy. In Italy, any of those things would be treason. Here, they were democracy. One article detailed the controversy over Japanese internment camps. Giuseppe read it twice, confused. Americans were publicly criticizing their own government's decision. In newspapers, without being arrested? He asked Henderson about it. The farmer spat tobacco juice. "Yeah, that's a black mark on us. Locking up citizens just for their ancestry. Wrong then, wrong now. Some of us said so from the start. But you can say it. Openly. Free speech, son, even when the speech is about our mistakes, especially then." Giuseppe had lived 26 years believing that order required silence, that questioning authority meant chaos, that strong nations demanded unquestioning obedience. But America was strong specifically because it allowed dissent. The contradiction dissolved into a strange new logic. Freedom wasn't the absence of order, but its foundation. March 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Everyone could feel it. Germany collapsing from both sides. Italy already out. Its cities rubble. Its people starving. The prisoners at the camp traded rumors about repatriation. When would they go home? What would home look like? Giuseppe received another letter from his mother. This one was more hopeful. The Americans were distributing food. The bombing had stopped. Maria had found work with the occupation forces translating. The family had enough to eat. Barely, but enough. Perhaps things will get better now, his mother wrote. Perhaps this is the new beginning the priest speaks of. Giuseppe wanted to believe it. But he'd also read about the political chaos in Italy. The communists and Christian Democrats fighting for control. The country split, occupied, humiliated. It would take decades to rebuild what Mussolini's vanity had destroyed. He thought about Mr. DeMarco's grandfather arriving in 1889 with nothing, building a life, dying prosperous. Giuseppe had engineering skills, English language ability, and American connections. He had Henderson's recommendation. He had the address of the DeMarco family in Brooklyn with a standing invitation to visit. He had, in other words, what he needed to start over. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The camp erupted in celebration. American guards and Italian prisoners alike celebrating the end. Not victory for one side. The sides seemed increasingly meaningless now, but the end of killing. Giuseppe and Carlo stood by the fence watching fireworks over the nearby town. "It's really over," Carlo said. "In Europe, anyway." "What will you do?" Giuseppe had been thinking about this for months. "I'll request to stay, apply for residency once it's allowed, work, save money, sponsor my family to come if they want." Carlo was quiet. Then, "I'll miss you, friend. You could stay too." "No." Carlo shook his head. "My roots are in Calabria, olive trees my great-grandfather planted. I need to go back, even if there's nothing but ruins. Some men are meant to rebuild where they're from. You're meant to build somewhere new." It wasn't a judgment, just an observation. And it was true. July 1945. The conversation. Henderson called Giuseppe to his office, a small room in the barn that smelled of hay and motor oil. "War's winding down," Henderson said. "They'll start sending you boys home soon." "Probably by fall." Giuseppe nodded. "Thing is," Henderson continued, "I could use help. Farm's getting bigger. My son's staying in the Army. Claire's heading to college. I need someone who knows the work and won't complain about the hours." Giuseppe's heart accelerated. "You're offering me a job. Can't officially hire you while you're a POW, but after repatriation, if you come back legal-like, there's work here, room in the barn apartment, fair wages, path to citizenship if you want it." "Why me?" Henderson lit his pipe, considering. "Because you work hard without being told, because you're smart enough to learn anything, because you look at this country like you're seeing water after crossing a desert. Men with that look make good Americans." Giuseppe felt something crack in his chest, not breaking, opening. "I'll come back," he said. "However long it takes. Whatever I have to do. I'll come back." Henderson extended his hand. They shook on it. The deal sealed in the old American way, a handshake and a man's word. September 1945. Departure. The prisoners assembled for transport to the ships that would take them home. Giuseppe carried almost nothing. A duffel with clothes, some letters, a photo of the DeMarco family that Mrs. DeMarco had mailed him. Carlo embraced him at the truck. "Good luck, my friend, in your new life." "Good luck in yours. Make those olives grow." The journey back across the Atlantic felt different from the journey over. Then, Giuseppe had been defeated, uncertain, still clinging to the ideology that had betrayed him. Now he was clear-eyed, purposeful, already planning his return. The Liberty ship docked in Naples. The city looked worse than Giuseppe remembered. Huge sections simply gone, replaced by rubble. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed. This was victory? This was liberation. But slowly, gradually, in small ways, Giuseppe saw reconstruction beginning. Americans and British engineers marking streets for rebuilding. Food distribution centers, medical clinics. The occupiers weren't conquerors. They were administrators, laying groundwork for recovery. Subscribe to hear the next incredible story that official history forgot. Let's continue. October 1945. Palermo. His family's home had survived. Damaged, certainly. Windows blown out. Part of the roof collapsed, but standing. His mother wept when she saw him. His father, aged 20 years and 5, embraced him silently. Maria was different. Harder, sharper, more like Claire Henderson than the shy girl he'd left behind. The war had changed her too. "You're really going back?" she asked that first night after their parents had gone to bed. Giuseppe nodded. "As soon as I can arrange it." "Abandoning us?" "Saving us. I'll make more in a month at Henderson's farm than I could in a year here. I'll send money, good American dollars. That'll help you rebuild." Maria studied him. "You sound American already." "Maybe. Is that bad?" "I don't know yet." She smiled slightly. "But I understand. Italy took 5 years of your life and gave you nothing back. America gave you dinner and a future. The choice seems obvious." His father was less understanding. "Men don't abandon their homeland. Homeland abandoned me first, Papa. Sent me to die for lies. I was lucky enough to become a prisoner. Other men weren't." "Still." "Look around, Papa. We lost. Completely. Italy will take decades to recover. I can help more from America than from here." His father had no answer to that. The truth was too obvious. Giuseppe spent 3 months in Palermo, helping repair the house, working odd jobs, saving every lira. He visited the university where he'd studied engineering. Most of the buildings were damaged, the faculty decimated by war. It would be years before the university functioned properly again. In America, universities were intact, growing even, with soldiers returning on the GI Bill. Giuseppe had read about this. America investing in its veterans' education, turning soldiers into engineers, doctors, teachers. Italy had no such program. Italian veterans received little beyond the privilege of survival. January 1946. The application. The American consulate in Naples was overwhelmed with visa applications. Giuseppe waited 6 hours for his interview. The consular officer, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Patterson, reviewed his papers skeptically. "You were a prisoner of war." "Yes, ma'am." "And now you want to immigrate?" "Yes, ma'am. I have a job offer, a sponsor." He pushed Henderson's letter across the desk. "I'm an engineer. I can contribute." Mrs. Patterson read Henderson's letter carefully. "You worked on his farm?" "Yes, ma'am. 15 months. He speaks highly of you." She set the letter down. "I'll be honest, Mr. Russo. Former enemy combatants aren't typically approved for immigration. The quota for Italians is also very limited." Giuseppe's heart sank. "However," Mrs. Patterson continued, "we're trying to rebuild relationships with Italy. Men like you, educated, skilled, with American sponsors, help that effort. I'll forward your application with a recommendation." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This could take months, maybe years. The bureaucracy is extensive." "I can wait. I've waited this long." August 1946. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Giuseppe read it 3 times, hands shaking. Approved. He was going back to America. Legally this time. As an immigrant, not a prisoner. With papers, a visa, and a future. His mother cried. His father remained stoic but shook Giuseppe's hand firmly. Maria helped him pack. "Send for me someday," she said. "When you're settled, when I'm ready. I want to see this America that changed my brother." "I will, I promise." September 1946. New York Harbor. Giuseppe stood at the ship's rail, watching the Statue of Liberty grow larger. He'd seen her before, from the Liberty ship's hold in 1944. But that was as a prisoner. This was different. The statue represented something real now, not propaganda or empty symbolism, but a tangible promise that a man could start over, that the past didn't have to define the future, that hard work and freedom could build something better than what he'd left behind. Henderson met him at the dock, driving the same battered truck from the farm. "Welcome back, son. You ready to work?" "Always." The farm looked exactly as Giuseppe remembered. The fields, the barn, the house. Claire was away at college. Henderson's wife had prepared a room in the barn apartment, small but clean, with a bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the cornfields. "Wages are $50 a week to start," Henderson said. "More when you prove you're worth it. Room and board included. Sundays off unless there's an emergency. Fair?" More than fair. Giuseppe started the next morning. The work was familiar, comforting. He fell into the rhythm of it, sunrise to sunset, planting and harvesting, maintaining equipment, managing the growing operation. But this time, he was building something, not just for Henderson, but for himself. Every dollar saved brought him closer to his goals. Citizenship, university, eventually bringing his family over. November 1946. Brooklyn. Giuseppe took the train to Brooklyn on a Sunday. The DeMarco family greeted him like a returning son. "You came back." Mrs. DeMarco embraced him. "You actually came back." The apartment was exactly the same. Same cramped rooms, same smells, same noisy abundance. Mr. DeMarco was older, grayer, but still loud. "Kid kept his word," Mr. DeMarco told the table. "Said he'd come back free, and here he is. That's character." Vincent was taller now, talking about college. Angela was engaged to a soldier who'd come home from Germany. The family had prospered during the war years. Mr. DeMarco's shipyard job had paid well. They wanted to know everything. Giuseppe told them about the farm, Henderson's offer, his plans for citizenship and education. Engineering. Mr. DeMarco nodded approvingly. "Good field. Country needs builders now. Lots of construction coming. Houses, roads, bridges. You picked right." After dinner, sitting in the living room with coffee and cigarettes, Mr. DeMarco asked the question Giuseppe had been expecting. "No regrets. Leaving Italy?" Giuseppe considered carefully. "I miss my family. I miss certain things about home. But regrets? No. Italy chose its path. I chose mine. Both choices have consequences." "You sound American already." "I'm trying to be. It's harder than I expected. The language, the customs, the way things work. But I'm learning. That's all anyone can ask. My grandfather, he never lost his accent, died speaking English like a Neapolitan, but he was American in his heart. That's what matters." Years pass. 1947, 1952. Giuseppe became an American citizen in 1949. He cried during the oath ceremony, overwhelmed by the weight of it. From enemy combatant to citizen in 5 years. He enrolled in City College in 1950, studying civil engineering at night while working the farm during the day. Henderson was patient with the schedule, understanding Giuseppe's ambition. "Education's important," Henderson said. "You get that degree, you'll do more than farm work. Nothing wrong with farming, but you're built for bigger things." Giuseppe graduated in 1954. His thesis was on bridge design, specifically efficient reconstruction of war-damaged infrastructure. He drew heavily on what he'd seen in Italy, the challenges of rebuilding amid scarcity. Several firms offered him positions. He accepted one in New York City, working on the expansion of the highway system. The work was exactly what he'd dreamed of, building things, solving problems, creating infrastructure that would last decades. He brought his sister Maria over in 1956. She was 28 now, still sharp, still determined. She found work as a translator at the United Nations, thriving in the international environment. His parents remained in Palermo. "Too old to start over," his father said, but Giuseppe sent money regularly, American dollars that made their retirement comfortable. In 1958, Giuseppe married Claire Henderson. She'd become a teacher after college, pragmatic and capable like her father. Their wedding was at Henderson's farm, a small ceremony with the DeMarco family in attendance. Mr. DeMarco gave a toast to Giuseppe, who came here as a prisoner and stayed as family. That's the American story, right there. 1965, Brooklyn. Giuseppe brought his teenage son Thomas to visit the DeMarcos. Mr. DeMarco was retired now, moving slowly but still loud. Mrs. DeMarco still cooked vast Sunday dinners. Thomas, born in America, found the apartment cramped and old-fashioned. He didn't understand the significance. Later, walking back to the subway, Giuseppe tried to explain. 20 years ago, I sat at that table as a prisoner of war, a defeated enemy soldier who expected to be treated with contempt. Instead, they fed me, welcomed me, showed me that people could be free without chaos, prosperous without cruelty. But they were just being nice, Thomas said. They were being American, which, I learned, is different from what I'd been taught American meant. Thomas didn't fully understand. How could he? He'd grown up with abundance, with freedom, with the casual expectation that tomorrow would come. He'd never known hunger or fear or midnight arrests. Giuseppe didn't resent his son's innocence. He'd worked hard to provide it, but sometimes he wondered if the younger generation could appreciate what they had, never having known what it meant to live without it. 1984. Retirement. Giuseppe retired at 65, after 30 years designing bridges and highways across the Northeast. His projects carried millions of cars daily. Solid work, built to last. He and Claire bought a small house upstate, not far from Henderson's old farm. Henderson himself had died in 1972, leaving the farm to his daughter. Claire inherited it when her brother passed. They didn't farm it anymore. Too old, too much work. But they kept the land, leased it to a younger family. Giuseppe spent his retirement reading, gardening, and occasionally consulting on engineering projects. But mostly he thought about the distance he'd traveled, not just miles from Sicily to America, but the internal journey from zealot to skeptic, to immigrant, to citizen. One afternoon, going through old papers, he found the letter his mother had sent in 1944, the one about British soldiers giving them tins of meat, about Maria crying over real food. He read it slowly, remembering that version of himself, the young soldier who'd believed in empire and glory, who'd thought America was weak and decadent, who'd expected punishment and received dinner instead. "What are you reading?" Claire asked, bringing him coffee. "Old letters from the war." She sat beside him. "You don't talk about it much." "What's to say? I was wrong about everything. Then I learned better." "That's more than most people manage." Giuseppe smiled. "I was lucky. Lucky to be captured. Lucky to be sent to America instead of Russia. Lucky to meet your father. Lucky that Mr. DeMarco's politics ran loud enough to shock me into thinking. You made your own luck. You chose to see what was in front of you." "Some did. Some didn't." Carlo went back to Calabria. He's probably still there, growing olives, pretending the war never happened. Claire squeezed his hand. "You did more than survive. You built something." It was true. Giuseppe had built bridges, literal ones spanning rivers and highways, metaphorical ones connecting his old life to his new one. He'd built a family in a country that had once been his enemy. He'd built a career from ruins and reconstruction. The bridges would outlast him. That was the point of good engineering, to create things that served long after their creator was gone. 1994. The interview. A graduate student from Columbia University contacted Giuseppe. She was writing her dissertation on Italian POWs in America during World War II. Could she interview him? Giuseppe agreed, curious what academic interest his experience might hold. She arrived with a tape recorder and careful questions. Her name was Jennifer Morrison, earnest and thorough. "What surprised you most about America?" she asked. Giuseppe thought back 50 years. The food, the abundance, but more than that, the freedom to complain about it. "Can you explain?" In fascist Italy, expressing dissatisfaction with the government could get you killed. In America, I watched ordinary workers curse the president in their own homes. Nobody came to arrest them. That was incomprehensible to me. Did it change your views on the war? It changed my views on everything. Government, freedom, what prosperity actually looks like. I'd been taught that strength required authoritarianism. America proved that wrong daily. Jennifer scribbled notes. "Did you face discrimination as a former enemy?" "Some. Mostly suspicion at first, but Americans are pragmatic. Once they saw I worked hard and caused no trouble, I was accepted. Not immediately, not universally, but enough." "Do you consider yourself Italian or American?" Giuseppe smiled. "Both." "Neither. I'm a man who left one country because it betrayed its people and joined another because it didn't. My children are American. My grandchildren are American. But I still dream in Italian sometimes." "Any regrets?" "Missing my parents' final years. They died in Palermo while I was here. I sent money, but not presents. That weighs on me." Jennifer nodded sympathetically. "Would you do it again? Make the same choice?" "Without hesitation. I built a life here, a good life. Better than anything I could have built in post-war Italy." "My sister did the same. We survived, prospered, contributed. That's what immigrants do. We build." 2004. The bridge dedication. They named a bridge after him, a small one crossing a river in upstate New York, but still. Giuseppe Russo Bridge. A bronze plaque with his name and a brief biography. His children organized the ceremony. Thomas, now 50, a lawyer. His daughter Anna, 48, a doctor. Both successful, both American, both carrying his legacy forward. The mayor gave a speech about Giuseppe's contributions to infrastructure development, about the American dream realized through hard work and determination. Giuseppe listened, feeling strange. He hadn't sought recognition. He'd just done his job, built good bridges, lived quietly. But afterward, standing by the plaque, he felt a profound satisfaction. His name on a bridge in America. Permanent. Official. Belonging. A local reporter asked for comments. Giuseppe kept it simple. I came here with nothing. America gave me opportunity. I tried to repay it by building things that last. This bridge will serve people long after I'm gone. That's enough. That evening, Claire raised a glass of wine at dinner. To the man who built bridges. To the country that let me. Giuseppe replied. 2008. The last letter. Giuseppe's health was failing. 89 years old, his body finally giving out. Claire had died 2 years earlier. He lived with Anna now in her large house in Connecticut, cared for, but diminishing. Maria visited frequently. She was 80 now, still sharp despite her age. They spoke Italian together, the language of their youth, though both had spent more years speaking English. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed? Maria asked one afternoon. Giuseppe considered. I'd be dead, probably. Or poor. Or bitter. Italy recovered eventually, but it took decades. I would have missed the best years, waiting for things to improve. I would have stayed if you hadn't brought me over. I know. That's why I brought you. You deserved the same chance. Maria smiled. You saved me, Giuseppe. From a small life in a damaged country, I've seen the world, worked with diplomats and presidents, lived freely, because you showed me it was possible. We saved each other. You needed a path out. I needed family here. They sat in comfortable silence, siblings who'd crossed oceans and decades together, who'd witnessed history and survived it. When I die, Giuseppe said, I want to be buried here, in America, not sent back to Sicily. Of course. This is home now. Has been for 60 years. I know. Giuseppe died 3 weeks later, peacefully, in his sleep. The funeral was well attended. Children, grandchildren, former colleagues, the DeMarco grandchildren, neighbors, and friends accumulated over 6 decades. They buried him in a cemetery overlooking the Hudson River. His headstone was simple. Giuseppe Russo, 1919-2008, engineer, immigrant, American. At the service, Thomas read from one of his father's old letters to his mother in Sicily, written in 1946. I've chosen a new country not because I stopped loving Italy, but because Italy stopped being what it could be. America isn't perfect, but it allows imperfect men to build perfect bridges. That's enough for me. The bridges Giuseppe designed still stand. The Giuseppe Russo Bridge carries traffic daily. His children and grandchildren prospered in the country he'd chosen. In Sicily, the house his family owned was sold decades ago. New families live there now, unaware of the Russo history. The war is distant memory, barely taught in schools. But in upstate New York, on a small bridge over a river, a bronze plaque tells a different story. Of a prisoner who became a citizen, of an enemy who became a builder, of a man who recognized truth when he saw it, even when that truth destroyed everything he'd believed. The DeMarco apartment in Brooklyn is gone, demolished in the 1990s for new development. But the memory persists in family stories, passed down through generations. The story of Sunday dinner and the prisoner who learned what freedom meant. Henderson's farm still operates, run by the family that leased it. They know the history, that an Italian POW once worked these fields and decided to stay. Sometimes they tell visitors about Giuseppe Russo, the engineer who started as a prisoner and ended as a neighbor. History remembers wars through battles and generals, but wars are also won or lost in moments like these. A Sunday dinner in Brooklyn, a job offer in a barn, a handshake between former enemies. Giuseppe's story wasn't unique. Thousands of Italian POWs stayed in America after the war, choosing new lives over old loyalties. But each story was individual. Each man made his own calculation, weighed his own scales, chose his own path. Giuseppe chose to believe what he saw over what he'd been taught. He chose abundance over scarcity, freedom over order, future over past. And in choosing, he built not just bridges of steel and concrete, but bridges between nations, between ideologies, between the man he was and the man he became. The last bridge he designed, completed in 1983, a year before his retirement, spans the widest gap of his career. It's a beautiful structure, elegant in its simplicity, carrying thousands of cars daily between two states. Giuseppe never told anyone, but he privately called it his American Bridge. Not in his notes or specifications, just in his mind, because it represented everything America had taught him, that with proper engineering, any gap can be crossed, any distance can be spanned, any division can be overcome with the right design and sufficient will. The bridge stands today, nameless officially, but perfect in function. Cars cross it without thinking, drivers unaware they're traveling on infrastructure designed by a man who once fought against everything America represented. That's how it should be, Giuseppe would have said. Good bridges don't demand attention. They simply serve, silently, efficiently, permanently connecting what was once divided. And in that service, in that quiet connection, lies the true measure of what it means to build something that lasts.